Hello everybody, I'm Sean, and today I want to answer the question, is there a cure to sensory overload? Because sensory overload is a very harsh thing that a lot of people deal with from PTSD, from trauma, and sensory overload really just sucks. Sensory overload is basically an addition to what you're dealing with. It's an after effect, but it can also just be something you deal with also, but it can be an after effect of trauma. It can be an after effect of PTSD and traumatic events that cause you to go through something like this. And for me, it's really been the worst thing that I've had to go through, not being able to do certain things and being a highly sensitive person and having sensory overload can be sometimes very painful, right? So I really just want to talk about, what sensory overload is and really bring awareness to, how sensory overload is really formed and, how you can cure it, and if there really is a true cure to sensory overload. So sensory overload a lot of times is basically happens when you have an overstimulation of the brain, right? A lot of times when we have sensory overload, it's too many things happening at once. A lot of times too many noises, too many people, too many crowds, too many sights, too many lights, too many things just going on at once, too many things we hear, and it triggers us, right? Sensory overload can be a major trigger, right? But sensory overload is not a scientific disorder, right? You can't be identified as someone who has sensory overload. It's not an official disorder. But sensory overload causes and can cause SPD, right? SPD is sensory processing disorder. Now, this is an official disorder that you can be identified with and actually have. Because sensory overload is a lot of times everybody goes through sensory overload, but when people are going through it from trauma, it can be very harsh. But anybody can really experience sensory overload at any time of their life, right? That's essentially just a normal panic attack, right? But with people who, are dealing with trauma, a lot of times that's when sensory overload turns into SPD. And when this happens, a lot of times, from trauma, our brain gets damaged. From emotional trauma, our brain gets damaged, right? Because there's certain parts that function to regulate our emotions and respond to emotions like fear and anxiety and anger, right? And one of these parts is called the amygdala. Now, people with SPD oftentimes have a damaged amygdala. And this is due to trauma and emotional pain. But a lot of times, people with SPD have experienced sensory overload their whole life. A lot of people who experience sensory overload are children. Maybe they're a sensitive person, but a lot of times, children who go through trauma, who are going through ongoing trauma, have a sensory overload from a young age. They become a highly sensitive person at a young age. And a lot of people can be born like that or, be like that at a very young age, be very sensitive and, sometimes even over aware, right? That's essentially overstimulation. But a lot of times, people who have experienced sensory overload their whole life have, as a result, SPD, sensory processing disorder, causing them to really have exaggerated perceptions and reactions to things like noises and lights. And Oftentimes these reactions, like I said, when you normally have sensory overload, it can cause you to panic. But when someone's dealing with trauma, and an after effect from trauma could be depression, but when the after effect, or one of the after effects, is sensory overload, a lot of times these reactions and responses are exaggerated, right? Due to the damaged amygdala, because the amygdala is the part of the brain that recognizes the fear, recognizes the emotion, right? But a lot of times we can't identify this emotion so clearly, so a lot of times we have confusion. A lot of times these emotions become more than what they really have to be due to a damaged amygdala from trauma. So basically, in the body, sensory overload will cause uncomfortable feelings, and the amygdala will recognize this pain as basically a trigger, right? It's already a trigger. It's already causing the prefrontal cortex, right? Because the amygdala is what recognizes the pain. The prefrontal cortex is what causes the response, right? To this emotion, to this thing that caused the fear, right? So when you're hearing all these noises, or having a sensory overload, a lot of times what happens in the body is you have all these uncomfortable feelings, right? And essentially the body starts to panic. Not only the mind, the body starts to panic. You start to feel rough in your fingers, weird muscle spasms, right? And essentially this is a panic attack. This is a trigger, but it's so much more harsh from trauma, from a severe sensory overload, from a severe SPD moment, especially for a highly sensitive person. But we'll get to that later, right? But essentially, normally when the prefrontal cortex is healthy, when it starts to respond, it responds in a rational way. That's its job. It's supposed to react and respond in a rational way. But when damaged, it reacts in an irrational way. And a lot of times through triggers and noises and things, we hear these and we get triggered, and now we're reacting irrationally. So a lot of times sensory overload is really a part of depression, is really a part of anxiety, a part of, all these disorders, but except it's so much more different because it's what you actually feel. It's not really, what you're actually going through. It's a difference, right? Because depression is what you're going through. But a lot of times in depression, you're numb. And anxiety, a lot of times you're just panicking, you're aware. But imagine being anxious and having a sensory overload, then you feel all these things in your body, and you're not only is your mind panicking, your body's also panicking. So what really causes sensory overload in children? Neglect is a big thing that causes sensory overload because of lack of stimulation, right? That's why in depression, like I just said, numbness, right? So you don't really feel anything, but you can still have a sensory overload. So sensory overload is like a whole different world of affection, or a way you could be affected through trauma, through pain, through PTSD, right? So a lot of times when we're neglected, we don't feel love, we don't feel all these things. So a lot of times our body doesn't know how to react, right? And that starts in the mind, because the mind adapts to being around people who are supposed to show you love, supposed to be there for you. When you don't feel that, what's created is numbness. But essentially through numbness, when the body's trying to regenerate feelings, that is when the sensory overload essentially happens, and that is when certain muscle spasms come up. Or that is also through depression a happy moment. And that's how a happy moment is created, right? Because it just pops up. Because through your childhood, you were neglected. You didn't know how to deal with this. You didn't feel all these things before. So really what this is causing is a sensory dysfunction, right? Because it will lead to senses not being able to have a input in life, right? If a child is being neglected, or if you never were able to regulate your emotions due to trauma when you were a child, and now you're all grown up, you never learned how to input that into your life, so you never learned how to actually have any sort of sense. And that's why a lot of children who go through trauma, they grow up not knowing who they are, not having a sense of who they are, right? And this is very unhealthy, because now we can't regulate our emotions, we can't know our emotions, and our emotions don't function regularly, right? So essentially, we're either super overstimulated or not stimulated at all. So complete sensory overload, and after the sensory overload, we crash and come back to that numbness, right? So it's common to have depression and a sensory overload. So highly sensitive people, or HSPs, have oftentimes sensory overload. Me, myself, I am a highly sensitive person, but I've learned that sometimes that cannot be a good thing, right? Sometimes it's a gift. A lot of times people will say, if you're a highly sensitive person, you're a gifted child, you're a gifted person. And that is sort of true, but that is also sort of the wrong type of perception. Because a lot of times, highly sensitive people are already very sensitive, right? But that doesn't mean that every highly sensitive person has sensory overload. It's just that when they do have sensory overload, they oftentimes have erratic and very sensitive responses to things like sounds and touch, right? And oftentimes these reactions can actually turn to be painful, right? Because a lot of highly sensitive people, they feel a lot of things, they hear a lot of things that people don't hear. A lot of things that are so small, so tiny, as someone maybe not be able to hear, a highly sensitive person can actually hear and recognize, right? Things like that. So a highly sensitive person having sensory overload, having already a brain that's already normally overstimulated, because always thinking, always analyzing, when they have a sensory overload, now the brain is overstimulated, just off the charts. And now this reaction can turn so painful, right? And a lot of times, sensitive people just in general have a sensory overload, but it's only very serious for people who are considered highly sensitive people, or just people who've dealt with trauma, right? Because you can turn into a highly sensitive person because of your trauma, or sometimes you just become like that. But a lot of times, sensory overload causes us to feel things that nobody else is feeling. It causes us to be super aware, kind of conscious of consciousness, aware of awareness, which is essentially a mindfuck. Sensory overload causes a heightened experience of senses. Being a highly sensitive person is not necessarily a disorder, but mainly just an attribute, right? Sensory overload can cause you to feel overwhelmed due to, loud noises, etc. But sensory processing disorder, or SPD, is when the person perceives sensory things to be more than what they actually are, right? So what does this mean? Sensory processing disorder causes the brain to not process senses and info from senses, which is essentially causes a lack of stimuli. But a lot of times, the human brain is trying to clash with this. So a lot of times, we're trying to regulate our emotions. We're trying to understand our emotions, but it just won't be stimulated enough for us. So essentially, it's like fighting fire and water. And your brain can't heal on its own. So a lot of times, we're trying to understand this and process these emotions, but our brain just can't, and get info from these senses. Like, why are we feeling this? So a lot of times people with SPD have a lack of stimulation, causing them to be numb and depressed. And a lot of times they're depressed, but they don't know why, because they can't identify these feelings. That's why through trauma, through our healing process, it's sometimes very hard for someone with sensory overload to identify the pain, because the pain can be coming from so many different things that we've never known our whole life. And now we're actually trying to recognize this, right? And through this process, right, our brain is not really being stimulated, right? But then this is SPD, right? So SPD is when your brain doesn't know how to process the senses and get information from the senses, which causes a lack of stimuli. But too much stimulation would be a sensory overload. So essentially what that means is SPD and sensory overload are two very, very different things, but one can cause and lead to the other, and vice versa. So a lot of times sensory overload leads to SPD, leads to you eventually being so stimulated that eventually your brain and mind can't handle it. And that's essentially how the pain goes into the body, right? That's how sensory overload leads to SPD, right? And that's how numbness is created in the body, because first it's too much stimulation, but some of it is in your mind. It's not only in the body, it's in the mind coming down to the body, right? That's why anxiety mixed with sensory overload. But SPD, right, eventually you have so much overstimulation that your brain and mind eventually shuts off. And all the pain now, all the senses goes directly into the body. So only thing you can identify is now in the body, which is essentially creating sensory processing disorder. But now that is also how numbness is created, because now it's all in the body, but the body can only hold so much trauma, so much pain, to the point where it just becomes so tensed up that now it's so hard to feel loose, right? And oftentimes in the body, when real energy is flowing, the body is loose, it's not tensed up. So when tensed up, that's how numbness is created, and that's how sensory overload leads to sensory processing disorder. So, is there a cure to sensory overload? Science and scientific studies will only say to deal with sensory overload. What this means is coping. But the whole process of coping and the level people stay at and get stuck at is basically behind coping. Basically, they don't go past coping. First is recognizing the pain, then is coping with the pain, then is healing. First, people recognize the pain because they don't even know what's happening. Then they start to cope. But then, what people don't do is move on to healing, and essentially that is the final step, to heal, and to heal totally, right? Because healing can be a lifelong journey. If you heal fully, if you heal now in the moment, okay, cool, that's good. But what people get wrong is to heal now is not to heal finally and to heal truly. To heal now is what sometimes you might need, sure, but honestly, that weed may seem so strong, that drug that you take just to heal your pain right now in the moment may seem so good and so strong and seem like it's actually working, but really it's not, because essentially what you're doing is just putting all this pain down, right? And imagine when all this pain just builds up and builds up and builds up, and now when it comes out, now you have more shit to deal with, instead of now looking at it as an opportunity to heal, right? Because you already know the pain, you're already coping with it. Now you just have to accept it and heal and start the healing process, right? But healing sensory overload specifically also can be a long process. Duh. But scientific studies say that most children, like I said, deal with sensory overload. And with time, as they get older, it goes away. But this process of waiting can be sped up. And all the times, you don't want to just be waiting. Waiting is much more different than healing. Healing, sure, you're still going to be sitting still, but you're not just sitting around with the pain, right? You're actually facing the pain and healing with the pain. You're not moving so fast, right? So you don't just wait completely, but you don't also just completely rush. You have to have balance, right? Balance is everything. Balance between the mind, balance between the body, balance between healing, balance between relationships, balance between life and work. Balance is where you need to be, right? So the process can be sped up, but not necessarily rushed through of, healing from sensory overload, right? So what causes sensory overload? What is the cause of sensory overload? Why do we have sensory overload? Why do we have all these feelings in our body? Why do we feel so overwhelmed when we hear noises, when we see things, when we see too many bright lights, when we hear too many people talking at once? Why do we panic? Why does this happen? To be honest, I don't know why it happens, because if I was to know, then that means that it would be the same for everybody, essentially meaning that there would be an answer to, is there a cure, right? If I just knew why. Because I don't know why, because it's different for everybody. Me and you might both have sensory overload, but the way you deal with it and what you feel in your body is not what I may feel in my body, and the way we both heal and cope with it may be so different. Even though we're both going through therapy, even though we both may have depression, even though we both may have PTSD, the way we heal and cope with it is so different, right? So science doesn't say what's right or wrong. Science doesn't determine what's right or wrong. Science only is to basically determine an experiment, right? In psychiatry, in therapy, you can get an understanding of your pain, but that doesn't mean what you do from the pain that you recognize now will be right or wrong. That's still up to you. So science can never determine a right or wrong. Science is basically just an experiment. A lot of times we get triggered from places and people, and oftentimes habits, right? We're doing the same thing over and over again. We know it fucks with us, but we still do it, right? So what do I mean by avoiding this? I don't mean by avoid to run away. No, don't run away. That is always the wrong decision. You will never have to run away, because a lot of people have been running away their whole life. Imagine that. Being scared and stuck with the pain their whole life. I wouldn't want to live that life, because that means that I have to live with the pain and suffering to the day I die. But that can only lead to bad things, like becoming an abuser, taking drugs, getting addicted to alcohol, right? It can only lead to so many bad things. So don't run away. But also, don't trigger yourself, right? Don't trigger thyself. Because a lot of times we think about not doing a triggering thing, right? Eventually, we learn what triggers us. We know what triggers us, but freedom matters, right? So a lot of times we want to do this thing, but we're thinking about not doing it. So we're so focused on not doing it that essentially we're running away in our mind, not only in real life, in our mind too. So that actually ends up triggering us through that whole process of thinking about not doing something, because what that does is essentially and basically triggers and activates the amygdala, right, which can cause a response to fear, but basically from the prefrontal cortex, which can create more fear, right, because of the response, right? Like how I was saying earlier in the video, the amygdala is what recognizes the pain and recognizes the fear, the emotion, But the prefrontal cortex is what is your response to this fear. So if you're thinking about a person that triggers you and thinking about not coming around that person, doesn't mean if you don't think about not coming around that person, you should, right? Because then that's not balance. It never has to be this or that. It never has to be either or, right? That is not balance. If you're doing that, you're always going to be living temporarily. Always going to be living in this side for a couple days, then this side for a couple days, then this side for a couple seconds, this side for a couple seconds, and then first couple seconds. And that's how contemplation is created, right? You don't want to commit suicide, but you do want to commit suicide. But if you don't want to, right, as soon as you want to stop thinking about just suicide in general, then you feel like, okay, if I'm not thinking about not committing suicide, then now I have to come back to committing suicide, right? So it's always all or none, but that's not the right thinking pattern, right? That's an unhealthy thinking pattern and an unhealthy thought process and thought structure that can affect our lives heavily, right? So back to what I was saying about the brain and the amygdala. When you activate the amygdala by trying to not think about going to a triggering place or meeting a triggering person, what the amygdala does is recognizes, okay, this is what causes it, right? This is what's causing the fear. Thoughts about this. Or it recognizes the fear from the thoughts that you're having, from the experience that you're having. It recognizes the fear, right? And then after that, now you have to respond in real life. So after your amygdala is processed, right, then the prefrontal cortex is what is basically keeping you having a rational response. But when damaged, right, the amygdala doesn't know how to respond to fear. So when you're trying to not trigger yourself, right, and thinking about not doing certain things, essentially what you're doing is staying trapped. Why? Because you're creating more fear just by thinking about not doing it, right? No matter which way you go, all or none, both ways will still keep you the same, still keep you trapped, right? Both ways can still create fear, right? Thinking about doing it or thinking about not doing it, right? Because obviously you don't want to do it, but obviously you want to think about not doing it, right? So you want to feel like you're right. But when you have to feel like you're right and you have to force yourself to be right, that's wrong. And science cannot even prove right or wrong. You can't even prove right or wrong. Because what is right or wrong? Right or wrong is not a truth. There is no right or wrong. Only you decide what's right or wrong, but essentially doing the right thing and finding freedom is a completely different thing than just doing something right and something wrong, right? So that's just a perception that we have oftentimes and keeps us also trapped. But now that the amygdala is damaged, right, and we're trying to we're thinking about not doing the triggering thing or going to the triggering person, the amygdala is confused, right? You're in a brain fart. And now the amygdala recognizes this fear. That's when it becomes so much more than what it is, because you're basically creating more fear because you have to think about not doing it, otherwise you're scared. And a lot of people are scared to have balance because a lot of times we're scared to actually do the healthy thing because we've been doing the unhealthy thing for so long. And humans are an adaptive species, so they adapt to things quickly. So now we're adapted to doing the unhealthy things. When we want to change, it feels wrong. But is it actually wrong? Who knows? You may think it's wrong, but it's actually not. Because how is a healthy choice gonna be wrong? If to you it's a truly healthy choice, how is it wrong? Right? So from that, the amygdala getting overactivated because you're so stuck in either the superego, or the primitive desires, and the id mind, right? You're so urging to not think about it, to think about not doing it, but then your beliefs are, oh, I have to do this, essentially to gain freedom. But none of those are freedom, and freedom matters. So essentially this creates more fear, right? And from that, the prefrontal cortex is supposed to create a rational response, but when overactivated, now it doesn't, and damaged, it doesn't know how to respond. So now it responds in an irrational way, essentially causing you to panic, and from panics and from a sensory overload, all pushing down to the body. Too much sensory overload causes numbness, which causes depression, which causes pain, and essentially you're fucked. But we don't want this, right? We don't want this. So it's all about finding balance, and it's all about finding what works for you, but not necessarily through beliefs or desires, right? Just balance between those two so you can live a free, peaceful life. So, is there a cure to sensory overload? To be honest, I don't know if there's a cure to anything, because a lot of times there's already been a cure to all these diseases. There's already been a cure to depression, right? For years. There's already been a cure to cancer and things like that for years. But nobody wants to raise awareness about what's happening now, right? Because first, people might come to a conclusion about this, but then they come to a conclusion about things later in life, right? First, they said the keto diet is bad for you. Then 7 years later, a couple years later, they're saying the keto diet is good for you now and will actually heal cancer. So which is it, right? Science cannot prove what's right or wrong. So essentially, what is the cure? Who knows? Does there even have to be a cure? Right? But mainly, healing from sensory overload is a long process, but you have to be smart about it. You can't rush through the process, nor just be on your ass, right? Healing takes work, but work should not be overstimulated nor not stimulated at all. That's a problem most people have. Either they're too stimulated or not stimulated at all. Nobody can find a balance and actually be at peace, but yet balance and finding balance between those belief systems, those super moral codes, and those super desires that you have is the only time you'll actually find true peace. So if you think you're at peace with these beliefs, if you think you're at peace with all these desires that you're stuck with, you're really not. Life can be so much more better. So yeah. But that's it for the video. Subscribe, and I'm out.